Hello, welcome back to the studio. Well, after last week's little dipping of the toe into the world of loose painting, as promised, I've done something, well, a little more challenging this time. Now, if you're new to the world of painting in a loose style, a beginner, then this really is a video for you because I'm a beginner as well. Yes, I know, I've been painting for years and years and years, but the loose style of painting is something completely new to me. It enables you to use sort of your own feelings and expressions. You're not confined by colours too much or too much detail. You have to try and master the art of using brushstrokes really as single sort of kind of indications of where colours are, rather than sitting there sort of fussing over all the little details. It's a very freeing experience and one that I've thoroughly enjoyed. You can almost sense my joy as I paint this painting. It's so just different from what I'm used to doing, and I hope that you get a good chance to having a go at something like this yourself. At the very end of the video, I'll do a little roundup of all the little bits and techniques and things I've learned along the way. And then I hope you'll join me in painting more of these free-handed, loose style paintings in future. So, you know the routine. Sit back, relax, cup of tea in hand, definitely a notepad, and let's see if we can paint this lovely Cornish coastline scene together in a very loose, painterly style.
So here's my paper canvas. It's 12 by 16 and I coated it with 2 coats of grey gesso or acrylic and left it to dry completely. Here's my reference photograph, the beautiful Cornish coastline. And I've picked this because, well, see the difference between the background and the foreground. The distant skyline is very, very pale and the foreground very strong and dark. I'm going to use a variety of brushes, but which one should I start with? Small one, a big one, a medium one? Well, let's see. But I think I might start with a small one just for a bit of light sketching work. Here's my palette. I've set out just a few colours to start with. These two will be combined to make a nice lavender. With a touch of yellow ochre, they'll make a nice grey colour called Payne's Grey. So that's our starting point. Make a lavender colour. And then work in a small amount of the yellow ochre. This gives us this nice warm grey tone, often called Payne's Grey, and it's a very useful colour. If I want to lighten it slightly, I'll add a touch of titanium white. You see, a sort of mauvey tone, but definitely grey. In a small dish, I have a couple of drops of odourless thinners. Make sure it's odourless thinners and not linseed oil. It needs to thin the paint down, just to be able to sketch with. I want to start off by mapping out the horizon line, which is definitely in the top section of this painting. Keep it fairly straight at this stage. As you can see, the next section down will be some land, and I've put in a line where I think it's going to be, but we'll see in a minute if I've got that right or not. As I say, at this stage it's just a sketch using a brush and some thinned paint. I keep my reference photograph close at hand and try and make sure I intersect the horizon line just about the right point. But as I mentioned, this is just a sketch, and it doesn't matter if it's not entirely accurate. It just has to look roughly the right sort of proportion, shape and size. It's all part of learning to paint in a loose style. I do a quick check on the number of hills and humps and bumps in this piece of land and then have a look at these distances. And you can see where the arrow points to. I'm a little bit tight in this position. I need to adjust the land in the background. And for this, I simply use a baby wipe. The paint has already started to dry, but it doesn't matter. I can rub out enough and allow me a chance to resketch. You'll see in the finished painting that none of those little corrections actually show. Now, as I mentioned, I want to work on where the shadows are going to fall in the foreground. I can do it at this stage and then make little corrections as I go. Once again, all we're doing is mapping out shapes. I'm not looking for any detail here at all. It's a little trap we fall into when we start to paint, that we think we've got to include every single little detail at this stage. But trust me, if we can latch onto one particular feature, like this little angle here, it gives me a sort of a reference point where I can sort of look at the other parts of the painting. Finding these little points of interest will really help you a lot when you come to do your own paintings. As I say, I'm just looking for shapes here, blocks of shadow. I'll try and put them in the right place and then sit back and look at it from the other side of the room. There, I think my underpainting is complete. I'll just lighten these up a little bit, make them a little bit less bold, and then just let the whole thing sit and dry. Probably going to take about half an hour. And here's my canvas after just half an hour. If I rub my finger on it, well, yes, a tiny bit comes off, but to the main point, it's just stained with colour. I'm going to be using this Bob Ross liquid white oil paint. This is a wet and wet oil painting technique, and I'm going to use this, a 1/2 inch bristle brush. I'm sorry, I'll mispronounce that again, a 1/2 inch bristle brush. And I want to apply a very thin, even coat over the entire surface of the canvas, including the areas which I've already sketched. The paint wants to be applied so thinly you can still see the outline of your work. And here it is, just enough to make the canvas wet. I'm going to test my canvas using my fingertips. I want just the smallest amount showing. That's it, perfect. I'm going to use that 1/2 inch bristle brush again, so I dry clean it on some paper towel first. For my background sky, I want to use a lot more titanium white and just a hint of blue. Where's that cameraman when you need him? As you can just about see, I want a very pale blue, almost purple coloured sky. I'll tint it down a little bit using some of my Payne's Grey, which has got a little bit of a purple tint to it. There, the cameraman's got things just in the right position. That's where he's gone. Box testing. After a quick stand back from my painting, I think the horizon line is still a little bit too blue. So I'll take a good amount of titanium white and just fade it down a little more. I actually want to lose that line that I drew there in oils when we started. It's a very easy way of painting, just using a little bit of oil to sketch. You can just rub things out as you want. Here you see, that horizon line is practically invisible. I'll add a tiny bit of blue to my brush and just start working in the sea colour. Don't worry if you overlap the edges of the land in the background. Whoops, I think I went into the wrong colour there. But it doesn't matter. I dry clean my brush and I can just blend that out. Oils are so forgiving. It's the reason why I love oils. As I work down my canvas, I add a little more colour here, in sort of layers, but try and keep them fairly level. If you look at the reference photograph, you can see that they run, well, pretty much parallel with the horizon line. If you find you do dip at the edges a little bit, well, here's a little tip. Try using another long handled brush just to sort of give you a guide. It's an easy tip, and one you can easily do for your own paintings. And don't forget, make sure your sea does go off the edge of your canvas. Again, another little touch up. I think in the foreground, the sea just under this piece of land is a lot stronger. Actually a bit more greeny looking in the reference photograph, but I quite like the blue lavender tones I've got. I'll go back in and just very loosely rough in the outline of the sea. Remember, we're painting loosely, so don't overwork this. I did a nice stand back from my painting and thought that the sea looked a little too pale, so I darkened it a bit more and added a bit of texture by a little bit of tapping and dabbing, but nothing else. I've gone back into my lavender colour and I want to just add a little bit of a reflection here, just the suggestion down in the water. An essential piece of advice I was given was don't marry the photograph, use it for inspiration. So add a little touch of detail where you want for your own painting. Just don't overwork it.
So this is the first stage of my little Cornish seascape scene, and it's at this point I think where we could potentially stall. This is the point at a painting when you've just gotten going, really, that there's a sort of resistance, I think, to wanting to move on and do something else. We could just sit here and carry on playing with the sea. It's not broken and it doesn't need fixing, but there is an element in all of us, I think, sometimes when we're wanting to paint, is to try and do every little stage perfectly. The problem is that what is perfect? As far as I can see, I don't need to do anything else to this sea. But I quite easily spend happily hours blending, moving, rubbing out, and basically undoing a lot of the work that I've already done. So I get to the stage with the sea and the sky where I think it's good enough. If you catch yourself saying, I'll just, then you should be thinking, I'll just stop and do the next stage of my painting. I can come back and have a little play with this if I absolutely have to. So that's stage one. Get the background sky, get the sea in quickly, and then move on. Don't sit and fiddle.
Let's have another look at our reference photograph, particularly this piece of land in the distance in comparison to the foreground. Look at the depth of colour. Here's a neat little trick. I cut a slot in a piece of paper and covered up most of the image. Now you can just check out the colours in one little area. How pale it is in the background and how strong the colour is in the foreground. Particularly the sea. It's almost black in the foreground. Now you've got an idea of how pale things need to be and how strong things need to be to make your painting work. Time to mix up some colour for those background hills. For this, I'm going to start out with some yellow ochre and a touch of black. I want a nice sort of greenish tone. As you can see from the reference photograph, it's not strong, it's quite a weak green colour. That sludgy green colour is too strong, so I'll add a good amount of titanium white to it to pale it down. That'll be a feature of the background. We use a lot more white in the background colours. And as I suggest, always start with the biggest brush possible. Remember, if we want to paint loosely, then you don't want to be using a small brush. Use nice broad brush strokes. It's a bit of a key to learning that loose style. You're just looking to create shapes and form. It's quite surprising actually that once you get used to this style of work, you can actually create a landscape very quickly. Just have to add a tiny bit of shadow here and there and let your brain work on the rest of the detail. You don't need to paint it. Although I've been painting for many years, I'm extremely new to this style. Painting only shapes and no detail. Very impressionistic. And it's rather refreshing and fun. Just remember, all of the background details here need to be dulled down with a little bit of white. Everything needs to be toned down and made to look pale. Here I'm using dark sienna, titanium white, and a touch of yellow ochre for some of the rocks. Once again, I emphasise we're not looking for an exact match on colour, but I tend to work using a spectrum of colours, from yellow ochre through to white or sienna, and then I load the colours as I need on my brush. Once again, using my reference photograph for inspiration, I just add touches of highlight. Loose strokes, no detail. You'll hear me say that often throughout this painting. As you see the reference photograph appear in the corner, I just want a suggestion where the light falls, where the shadow falls. Little sparkle here, a little shadow there. I add little touches of colour, stand back, and then work to my painting and add a little more. This way, I'm working my painting up in stages, trying to pick out shape and form from the reference photograph. If you're enjoying my tutorial, don't forget you can always like and subscribe to the channel. It doesn't cost you anything, but every time I release a new video, you'll be the first to know about it. And if you want to do a little more, you can always leave a tip in my coffee cup. I spend all the money on fresh oil paints and supplies. Thank you. Another top tip is to try and use the same colour in several areas of your painting. This creates a more harmonious scene rather than lots of chopping and changing lots of sort of dissimilar colours. As As you see, I've got just a few shadow areas left to put in, but they're not truly dark like the foreground ones. They're more purpley toned, not quite such a deep tone. So once again, I go to my lavender, maybe a little more to the blue side and a bit more titanium white. I look at my reference photograph and again try and pick out a few of those shapes. Looks like a bit of a sort of jagged tooth shape there. You'll also notice that I've changed to a small round brush, and this is the smallest brush I'm going to use. It's pretty old and pretty worn out, so I can't do anything detailed with it. It's perfect just to block in a little bit of shadow here and there. I think to anchor this little piece of the land to the sea, I need to add a shadow line. Check out the reference photograph, you can see that the water is just a little darker. This really makes a big difference to my painting. Once again, I just add a little touch of shadow here and there, loose strokes as always. Well, it was bound to happen sooner or later. It's a danger zone and mud mixing alert. That's right, as a novice in this style, it wasn't long before, well, I'm starting to fiddle with my painting. I started going back into my paints and I hear that little voice in my head saying, "I'll just." It was a near thing, but I stopped just in time.
So here's my painting so far, and I've got to say, I'm rather excited by what I've created here. But there was a moment right at the very end there. Remember that little saying, "I'll just"? Well, I was definitely having a bit of an "I'll just" moment right there. In just a few seconds, I was on the verge of just overdoing it, ruining my painting. It happened so quickly, it really called me out. So I learned something. Take your time, especially when you think you're getting to that break-even point where you might be just about to "I'll just" it to death. I certainly know that I need to take my time and be very intentional when I paint the foreground. I don't just sort of try and overpower it. I'm going to start working on this area next, and of course it's close to me, so I'm going to up the game in terms of colour and saturation. I want it to look a lot closer than the distance. Oh, and incidentally, I want to have a good look at this background sometime. Actually, there's an awful lot of the original grey colour peeking through. That's right, I used the grey of the canvas as one of my colours. It's a neat trick, so sometimes an underpainting can really be your best friend.
I look at my reference photographs through the letterbox again. As you can see, I think I've done quite a good job with this background, keeping it pale. In fact, I left quite a lot of the original grey showing through, and it really helped me. But I think I need to do the foreground now, before I start fiddling. We need to mix up some fresh colours. Don't use the ones that you were using for the background. Remember, the foreground colours need to be stronger. I used dark sienna, some yellow ochre, and a lot less white this time. Maybe one other colour as well. A little touch of alizarin crimson for a bit of heat. I want to sort of get a nice sort of burnt orange effect. There, we'll see if those colours work for our painting. I dry clean my brushes and go straight in to some lavender. And add some dark sienna to warm it up a touch. This is my shadow colour. As I'd already mapped out the positions of the shadows at the drawing stage, this should be fairly straightforward. Again, block in the shapes. One here, that little angle section there, a little bit above it. And it doesn't hurt to look back at your reference photograph and just to do a quick double check at this stage. Here you see I'm doing a quick double check, making sure I've got 3 of those at that nice angle in the right position, and then see if there's anything else I need to add. I think that could get blocked in. Once again, I'm just looking for my shapes. Now, I'm using my second dry cleaned 1/2" brush. Again, yellow ochre, a little bit of white. I said not to use too much white, but well, now I look at my painting and my photograph, I can see I actually need to go a little bit bright here. Drop in broad shapes again. That's that little angled stroke there. It looks like a sort of seat. I'm going to drop that in first. Once I've got that position of my painting, I can then work away from it. It gives me sort of an anchor point. I do nice, definite brush strokes. I can't afford to really overwork this too much because, well, I'll become a mud mixer. I also look for the same sort of colours elsewhere in my painting. I think I see a little more of this sort of yellow ochre colour higher up the peak. I drop them in, lean back in my chair, then add a little more. Once again, I stay loose and quick. I don't sit on my painting for too many moments. I stand back and hold my photograph at arm's length and compare it to the painting. It's really the only way if you can see if you're on track. And I'm really rather pleased with what I've done. Just looking for those shapes, not the colour or the detail, and yet there it is, a painting. And I did it. I'm amazed. Some of the rocks further up the cliff are sort of a greyish colour. I used some black and white and a little touch of my sort of lavender brown colour on that small round brush. I stand back, add a little bit, then stand back again. But I can't help feeling that, well, maybe I am getting back into the fiddling stage of things. Am I adding too much detail? Way too fiddly, I think. I'll put a little bit of highlight on my brush and just do the edge of a couple of these peaks and let the rest of it sort of sit on its own for a while. I'm learning that sometimes you just need to leave your painting alone. I think I'll add a little bit more detail. How on earth did I end up back here again? Fiddling. I'm afraid it tends to creep into our work if we're not aware of it. Just part of the learning process. I've gone back to painting those big shapes again. Yes, I feel much happier doing this now.
So here's my painting so far, and I think it's progressing okay, but I can't help feeling sometimes I'm getting a little bit lost with things. I think that I'm just getting confused as to where I am when I look at my reference photograph and I look at my painting. It's very easy to start sort of guessing what bit a shade and what bit a highlight and sort of just dabbing paint on there randomly. And that's how I feel about my painting right now. Maybe I am a little bit lost. So what should we do? I think the answer is walk away from your painting. Walk away from it, look at it from the other side of the room, and make a definite judgment as to whether you're closer to your reference photograph or not. This is, I think, part of the painting process where we have to be a little bit disciplined. That little "I'll just" moment in our head really wants to carry on painting, when in reality what we should be doing is not painting. We should be thinking about what we're doing more than doing things. I'm going to take a little break from my painting, a cup of tea, maybe come back in half an hour and see how I feel about it. I think I'm getting close to almost completing the painting. Yes, I don't think I need to really put much more into it. Anyway, let's see how we get on with the next stage of our painting.
After a bit of a rest from my painting, I realised I need another colour, Indian yellow, alizarin crimson, for a slightly lighter but deep orange colour. I think this might work. I can see on these rocks that there's slightly brighter sort of orange tones. Again, I used a small round brush here. I just want to add a few flecks of it along an edge, just on the top of a few rocks. Again, it's easy to get lost in the detail, so I try and be very intentional. I just add a few dabs where I think it really is going to make a difference, rather than guessing at it. After a little while, your eye becomes more attuned to a shape, and you start to sort of see things a little more clearly. It just takes practice. You see here, I'm just adding a little bit of highlight to the foreground hill to make it stand away from the background. I think time I add in these foreground rocks as well. That corner's looking a little bit sort of empty and a bit blank. I'm sure once that's got something in it, it'll look a lot better. Once again, I add a nice dark shadow to the bottom edge of these rocks to really anchor it into the painting. let's add some surf to the painting. I've washed one of my 1/2-inch brushes, got into a little bit of titanium white and tinted it with a little bit of the Prussian blue colour. I don't want pure white, that might be just a bit too stark. I'll just press my brush into the paint. Again, I want a little texture on my painting here. See the little touches of highlight here and there, not too many. Just go in and give it a light tap. Just leave a little bit of a speckle. This is about as little as I intend to do. If I play with it too much, well, I'm going to end up with a big smudge. So, a few touches, and then leave it alone. Add a few around the foreground rocks as well. I'm learning that sometimes less really is more, and just adding a few touches of highlight will keep your painting lovely and fresh if you just add it and then leave it alone. It's very tempting though to want to go back and just do a little too much. Yes, the I'll just moment nearly got me again. One final touch for my painting is to add a little bit of shine on the surface of the water. But again, I'm not going to overdo this. With that, I think I have a finished seascape, all painted in a very loose and painterly style. I have to say, I'm rather amazed and rather pleased. I hope you give this a try as well.
So here's my finished painting. And what did I learn? What should I put in my conclusion so that you can do your own painting? Well, first thing I learned was the brushes. Use the biggest brushes possible. I only really used that little brush there for the final sort of little touches, but I did probably 85% of my painting with a 1/2-inch brush. Stay big, it'll stop you getting too detailed and too fiddly. And that's the secret. We want to try and create a scene with big, bold, expressive strokes of paint. The second thing I learned is to stand back from your painting more often. You hear it in all my tutorials about that, standing back from your painting and looking at it from the other side of the room. Don't sit on top of it. You won't really see what you've done until you can get a good distance away. Leaning back in the chair just isn't enough. You really have to get up. And in the little brief pauses between certain sessions in my video, I'm not actually sitting there. I'm actually standing well back. I just edit out those little few minutes I spent walking away from my painting. I spent more time looking at my painting than I do actually painting it. The "I'll just" comment that happens in your head. This is probably one of the main things you can learn to do for any of your paintings. If you catch yourself saying, "I'll just," the chances are is you're just about to overdo it. If you hear "I'll just," think "I'll just stop," rather than "I'll just add some more." The fourth thing really is to not to be too critical of your work. Remember, no one's going to see this hanging on the wall with the reference photograph next to it. And the only person you have to make happy is you. It doesn't matter what anybody else thinks. If you're happy, it's a success. I think the last thing really is to be accepting of the fact that you need to use sort of broad brushstrokes and colour. You don't have to get it perfect. Colour, well, as you saw from my painting and the reference photograph, they're very different. And yet, clearly, it is exactly the same scene, but painted in a different style. I hope you enjoyed watching me paint this, and I hope I've encouraged you to maybe think about changing the way you paint, to throw off the sort of shackles of confinement and conforming to a certain way of painting anything. So that's it for this painting tutorial, and I hope you've really enjoyed it. I certainly have. Have I said that enough? I really have enjoyed this one. It's been so much fun. But I'd love to know what you think. I'd like to just spend a moment leaving a comment down below. Let me know if you want me to do more of this style of painting, or if you've got any other thoughts. I'd love to hear from you. And in the meantime, there's another lovely video for you to watch coming right along. Happy painting, people!